What's the big deal about nitrogen? I'm Jim Schwartz with 360 Yield Center. Today we're going to take a deep dive into nitrogen and talk about how to manage nitrogen on our farm to grow a 300 bushel corn crop. You know, it takes over 300 pounds of nitrogen to grow that 300 bushel corn crop. And although it's one of the most abundant elements on Earth and in our atmosphere, it's also one of the most common nutrient deficiencies we deal with every year. You know, nitrogen fertilizers continue to rise in cost. That's no surprise to you. But we have to understand how those fertilizers work on our farm to manage them better. So nitrogen really gets into the corn plant in the nitrate form, and nitrate nitrogen is negatively charged, just like your soil. So that nitrate molecule can leach down through the soil profile. If you look at this graph, it's an indicator of a trend in heavy rainfall in the U.S. over the last 50 years. And what you'll see is that is a definite trend. In fact, over that time frame, the incidence of 4-inch rainfalls has nearly doubled. If you look at this next graph, it indicates that in the upper Midwest, we've seen a 50% increase in 4-inch rainfalls in that geography. So the more rainfall we're having, and you think about nitrogen being a leachable molecule that moves down through your soil, that's a problem. In fact, if you look at the last 6 years, weather trends continue to change, and what we thought was normal now becomes the abnormal. Take a look at this graph from Iowa State Climatology. Now, this graph has a lot on it, but each one of those dots represents a growing season, all right? The blue squares represent every growing season from 1893 up until 1980. The blue triangles represent every growing season from 1980 to current. If you go across that bottom axis, left to right, that's May-June precipitation. On the left is less, all the way over on the right is more. If you go to the y-axis, that's July-August precipitation. The bottom is less, the top is more. So if a growing season falls in the lower left, that means it's a dry year. If it falls in the upper right, that means it's a wet year. So now let's take a look at what we see as we look at all those growing seasons. Look at the growing seasons from 1893 to 1980. You see those kind of in those red squares. And then, again, the blue triangles from 1980 to current. And what they've done is they've clustered what you would consider to be normal. That's in that pink area. But the interesting thing is, if you look at where the last 5 growing seasons fall on this chart, look at the different growing seasons. 2010, 2011, 2012, of course, the drought, 2013, 2014. Then, of course, where do you think 2015 is going to fall? Way up in the upper right quadrant. Here's really the take home of this chart. What we think is normal is now abnormal, and the new normal is abnormal as it relates to rainfall and precipitation. So as you think about the trends we're seeing with more heavy rainfall events and growing seasons that have a lot more water, how does that impact what we do with nitrogen? Well, nitrates in groundwater continue to be a big deal. In fact, think about my very first job in agriculture was in Northwest Iowa. I never thought I'd see the day where I'd see a city suing counties about nitrates in the groundwater, but that's the reality we're dealing in today. And we need to understand how nitrogen works in our soil so we can keep nitrogen out of the groundwater. To recap, you know, there's been a 50% increase in heavy rainfall events. And so that impacts what we do. Now, current hybrids are also changing. So not only is the weather changing, but the hybrids are changing as well. There's a lot of new research to indicate that modern hybrids are using more N later in the season. In fact, corn hybrids take up 75% or more of their nitrogen after they reach that V10 stage, about chest height. So why are hybrids taking up more nitrogen later in the growing season? Well, with the introduction of biotechnology, we're keeping insects out of them, we're keeping the roots healthier and alive longer, and the plants are staying alive longer. So naturally, they're taking up more nutrition later in the growing season. So then, what we see a trend to more heavy rainfall. We see a molecule, a nitrate molecule, that moves down through the soil profile with that rainfall. And yet, we see corn plants that need more nitrogen later in the growing season. So all these things are working against us, and we're also getting more and more conscious of nitrates in our groundwater. So we have to start thinking about how are we going to manage nitrogen to increase yields and feed a growing world, and yet be better stewards of our environment. So perhaps there's a combination of timing, placement, some way to start working with N to grow our yields, but yet reduce the impact of nitrates in our groundwater and our environment. Let's look at a real-world example. This field is about a mile from my house. This occurred in 2008, and I had a grower friend call me, and he had just applied his nitrogen 1 or 2 days before it started raining. And he called me and he said, Jim, look at my cornfield. Have I lost all my nitrogen? What do I do? If you look at this slide, what you see, this grower called me prior to tasseling, seeing some visual symptoms on his corn plant. And he said, Jim, what do I do? What's happened? Well, by the time we're done talking today, I hope you'll be able to answer these questions and understand better what's going on in each of those fields, because the answer may be different than what you think. There are 3 basic fertilizer forms that we're going to talk about today: anhydrous ammonia, urea, and UAN solutions, which are urea, ammonium, nitrate. UAN solutions like 28% or 50% urea, 25% ammonium, 25% nitrate. Now, there's other forms of nitrogen, but really when we think about nitrogen in our farm operations, really it's anhydrous, urea, or 28%. So we're going to spend some time talking about what happens to those nitrogen forms in our soils and how they interact with our operation. There are 3 ways that nitrogen is lost, and that's really where we have to start. If you think about nitrogen, we got to figure out what happens to it in our farm, on our soils. There's 3 ways. Number 1 is denitrification. Number 2 is urea hydrolysis. And number 3 is leaching. We're going to discuss all these in a little more detail. Here's what I really want you to take home from this, especially as it relates to denitrification and urea hydrolysis. Those are biological reactions. So a biological reaction, it has to do with oxygen, temperature, pH, moisture, residue. All those things impact biological reactions. We'll dig into that a little bit deeper. So let's first talk about nitrification. I guess the first question I'd ask is nitrification good or bad? Well, the answer is both. The reason is that nitrification, if you think about it, that's the conversion of the ammonium molecule over to nitrate molecule. Now, the corn plant takes up 75% of its nitrogen in the nitrate form. The reason for that is nitrate is mobile in soil water, and about 70% of the nitrogen is taken up through a process called mass flow. So you got to get the nitrogen into the water in order for the corn plant to take it up. So that's why nitrification is good. But if you look over on the right-hand side and look at this equation, you also see that nitrate molecule is negatively charged. And we talked about this earlier with all the heavy rainfalls. Bad things happen when that nitrate molecule is in our soil. So we need to understand this process in order to understand how to control it on our farm. So let's get to the nitrification process. Let's start with the ammonia molecule. That's NH3. When you add that to your soil, it has to grab a hydrogen out of water, and it combines to form ammonium. Now, the important part of that is the ammonium has a positive charge, your soil has a negative charge, so the ammonium is held tightly by the soil, and that's very important. Now, if you look at that, there's no oxygen involved in this process. So you can apply your anhydrous, it can start raining tomorrow, and it can rain for 2 weeks straight, and this process will occur because there's no oxygen involved. In fact, if you think about your soil pore space, about 25% of it should have oxygen in it. But even if it's all replaced with water, that part of this nitrification process can occur. The next step then is there's a bacteria called Nitrosomonas, and that Nitrosomonas bacteria starts converting that ammonium molecule first to nitrite, which is NO2. Interestingly enough, nitrite is toxic to the plant, so it quickly converts over to nitrate, which is NO3. Now, as we talked about earlier, that's good and bad. It's good because the corn plant takes up 75% of its nitrogen in that nitrate form. But it's also bad because this is where bad things start to happen. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But one thing I want to point out is you see that bacteria up there called Nitrosomonas bacteria. This is what N-Serve does. N-Serve, in essence, kills the bacteria Nitrosomonas. So it stops this process. It allows your nitrogen to remain in the ammonium form held by the soil. And then as that bacteria rebuilds and repopulates in your soil, it starts that conversion over into the nitrate molecule. But that's what Nitrosomonas bacteria do, and that's what N-Serve does. It kills Nitrosomonas. So remember this field? This is the field my friend called me about and said, Jim, I put on my nitrogen, it started raining, and it rained for a couple weeks. And I went out and looked at it, and if you look at that field, you may think, I'm out of nitrogen. But really, what's the problem in this field? He's not out of nitrogen. He applied anhydrous. It started raining. Remember, we talked about how you convert it to ammonium form, but there's no oxygen in that soil. That 25% of the pore space that should be oxygen is full of water. So the question is, where is his nitrogen? Did he lose it all? No, it's all sitting there in that ammonium form held by the soil. Now, he wanted to go out and put another 50 pounds of nitrogen on this field, but you know what I told him? And he thought I was crazy. I said, you don't have a nitrogen problem, you have an oxygen problem. So my recommendation to him was, I said, get your cultivator and let's open the field up. And he did that. And when he did that, go back to that equation, you can see that ammonium started picking up oxygen. And remember, we talked about how the corn plant takes up most of the nitrogen in that nitrate form, started converting it over, corn plant started taking it up. And in about 3 days, that entire field greened up. Now, he was really tempted, in fact, to put another 50 to 75 pounds of nitrogen on this field. Had he done that, he wouldn't have increased his yields, but he would have put more nitrate into the groundwater. So in his case, he did not lose a lot of his nitrogen into the groundwater through either leaching or he didn't lose it to denitrification. But let's talk about that process next. So if you remember when we talked about nitrification, we said it's good because the corn plant takes up that nitrate molecule. So let's start there, and let's start as we talk about denitrification. Let's start with the nitrate molecule. Now again, nitrate is negatively charged and it's very leachable through the profile. So that's bad. We don't want that. But not only does it leach, but it goes through this process called denitrification. All right. Denitrification is the conversion of that nitrate molecule over to nitrous oxide, dinitrous oxide, or pure nitrogen gas. Now, that is driven by organisms in your soil that require oxygen. So when your soil, remember we talked about 25% of the pore space should have oxygen. When we get rainfall, all right, when those pores become saturated, those organisms that are breaking down residue down in your soil, those organisms that do this, they're going to get their oxygen from someplace. And guess where they get it? They go up to that 50, 60 cent molecule of nitrate that you have, and they start pulling oxygen off of it and convert it to nitrous oxide, dinitrous oxide, or pure nitrogen gas. So this is what happens when we have nitrate and your soils become saturated. Those organisms convert that over to these gases and they go off into the atmosphere. That's denitrification, and that's not good. So the next fertilizer form we're going to talk about is urea and urea hydrolysis. What happens when you put urea on the soil in your operation? Okay, the urea molecule, that's what you see here starting in this equation, it combines with water, and guess what it becomes? If you look, it's ammonia, right? Now, if you don't get that ammonia molecule into contact with the soil, it's just like your anhydrous gas, right? It goes off into the atmosphere. So what we want to happen is get it in contact with the soil, again, grab a hydrogen from water and become ammonium, which is NH4, and be held by the soil. Now, this whole process is called urea hydrolysis. Okay, this is a bad thing because it hydrolyzes into a gas and goes into the atmosphere. Now, it's a biological reaction. So remember we talked earlier that things that drive biological reactions are things like pH, moisture, temperature, and water. For instance, if you're a no-tiller and you spread lime on top of your soil and you have a high pH on your surface of your soils and you throw urea on top, you're going to drive the urea hydrolysis process much quicker. If it's hot, if you've just had a rainfall, okay, all those things will drive urea hydrolysis quicker on your farm until you get it in contact with the soil. In fact, if you think about urea hydrolysis, for every day that urea lays on top of the soil, does not come in contact with the soil, you lose about 3% of that urea form of nitrogen. Now, when we're talking about 28%, 50% of 28 is in the urea form. So that's the part that's exposed to urea hydrolysis. Now, I've used the word urea a lot. This is all driven by an enzyme called urease. And there are products available, for instance, Limus, Agritane. What they do, they kill the urease enzyme. And in essence, they stop it from hydrolyzing or becoming a gas. And they give you about 10 days to 2 weeks to get that rainfall and get that urea in contact with the soil. Now, on a bare soil, you want around 1/4 of an inch of moisture. And in a heavy residue soil, it takes a little more moisture to get that urea molecule in contact with the soil. So you need about 4/10, maybe 1/2 an inch of moisture to get it in contact with the soil. So it becomes that ammonium molecule and it's held by the soil. All right, so this can be very complicated. So let's just review it one more time. There are three ways nitrogen is lost: denitrification, which really we're talking about the nitrate molecule; leaching, which is the nitrate molecule; and then volatilization, which in essence is urea hydrolysis, or that urea molecule becoming a gas that volatilizes off into the atmosphere. So denitrification, the ways we can minimize loss, and again, denitrification typically is in a clay, poorly drained, heavier soil. Maybe it's a soil where you have a compaction layer, even a density change. The way we can minimize denitrification is with a nitrification inhibitor, improve our drainage, reduce compaction, and balance our carbon-nitrogen ratio out. And we'll talk about the importance of carbon-nitrogen ratio as it relates to denitrification. Leaching, again, is movement of that nitrate molecule. Basically, the way you reduce leaching is to delay the conversion into that nitrate molecule. And there's different ways and different strategies to accomplish that. We're really more concerned about leaching on sands, coarse textured soils, or very well-drained soils. And then volatilization, again, that's really talking about that urea molecule. When I said urea hydrolysis, that's volatilization. How do we minimize it? Use a urease inhibitor, incorporate that nitrogen. Maybe we take water from the stem to move that nitrogen into the soil. Balance your surface pHs. All those things will slow volatilization or urea hydrolysis of that urea molecule. So as we talked about denitrification, one of the concepts I had mentioned was carbon-nitrogen ratio and how that impacted the denitrification process. Well, part of that entire process in the soil, there's something going on called mineralization or immobilization of the organic in your soil. And I think it's really important to understand that process as it impacts nitrogen in your soil. So what is mineralization? Mineralization is a biological process that releases organic in from the organic matter into the soil solution to be taken up by the corn plant. Since it's a biological process, again, it's highly impacted by things like temperature, moisture, pH, and aeration. Now, in a good mineralization year, you can release upwards of 20, 25, maybe even 30 pounds of nitrogen for every percent organic matter that's in your soil. So if you have a 3.5% organic matter soil, you can maybe mineralize 75 or more pounds of nitrogen, make that available for your corn crop. Conversely, if you have a cool year, a wet year when you don't have a lot of oxygen, or maybe you have a pH imbalance in your soil, you may mineralize much less nitrogen into the soil profile for your corn crop to take up. Now, the mineralization and mobilization process is also highly impacted by residue and the type of residue that goes into your corn crop. And that's where carbon-nitrogen ratio becomes a part of this process. So the carbon-nitrogen ratio balance in your soils, that's really what helps determine whether you're mineralizing that organic in or you're tying up that organic in a process called immobilization. There's a balance point in your soils, somewhere around 20 or 30 to 1. So if you have a carbon-nitrogen ratio above, say, 30 to 1, you're going to start tying up or immobilizing that in. If you plow down a residue that has a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio, you're actually going to mineralize or start releasing that nitrogen into the soil profile. So this is where something like previous crop and the carbon-nitrogen ratio of the previous crop will impact the nitrogen picture in your soil. So this is really what it looks like. Mineralization and immobilization is a process that is going on all the time in your soil, all right? It'll either immobilize or mineralize based on the carbon-nitrogen balance that's in your soil. So let's say, for instance, you plow down corn residue. Corn has a very high carbon-to-nitrogen ratio. And the organisms that start breaking that corn residue down, they need, as their food source, nitrogen. So as you plow down that corn residue already has about 15 pounds of nitrogen for every ton of dry residue. But it takes about 30 pounds of nitrogen to break that corn residue down totally. So we need to find 15 pounds of nitrogen for every ton of residue to break it down. So the organisms that are doing that, they're going to get their nitrogen someplace. Unfortunately, when you apply nitrogen into your cornfield, they're going to start taking your nitrogen and tying it up in order to break down a high carbon and nitrogen residue. That's what they do. So if you plow down, for instance, 4 tons of corn residue, they need an additional 60 pounds of nitrogen to feed themselves to break down that residue. So if you think about, there's a lot of growers now who are thinking about ways to manage this process so that instead of immobilizing nitrogen, tying it up, this is commonly referred to as the carbon penalty, all right? Instead of paying that carbon penalty in the corn crop, what if I can start breaking this residue down in the fall And then instead of immobilizing nitrogen in that May, June timeframe, maybe I can start mineralizing it by providing the nitrogen to those organisms in the fall or early spring, letting them work on this residue, and then mineralizing it earlier in the growing season, as opposed to them immobilizing or tying up your 60-cent pound of nitrogen molecule and immobilizing it and making it unavailable for your corn crop. So here's some common carbon to nitrogen ratios for different residue that you might find on your farm. So when you plow down alfalfa, it has a low carbon to nitrogen ratio of 13:1. Now remember, I talked about that break even is somewhere 20 to 30 or to 1. So when you plow down alfalfa residue, it has a low carbon nitrogen ratio, and so it starts releasing or mineralizing nitrogen into your soil. Conversely, let's look at small grain straw like wheat straw. Wheat straw has a high carbon nitrogen ratio of 80:1. So in order to break that residue down, you have to have nitrogen to do that. And so those organisms start pulling nitrogen from your soil profile to break that residue down, and that's called immobilization. Now, eventually, this nitrogen does get back into your crop, but unfortunately, a lot of times, this happens after the growing season is complete. So we need to think about strategies to manage the mineralization and immobilization process that's going on into your soils, so that we're making that mineralization process occur earlier in the growing season, and therefore managing the nitrogen when we put it on and how we put it on to mineralize, as opposed to immobilizing that nitrogen. So that mineralization and immobilization process is all about residue. And the breakdown of residue, again, it's a biological process. So many things impact it: temperature, pH, the size of the residue, moisture, oxygen, time, food source. You think about, I always tell people, think about, you can go to a dump 50 years after somebody's put a stack of newspapers in the dump, and what are you going to find 50 years later? You're going to find a stack of newspapers. You know why? Because the moisture doesn't get down there, oxygen doesn't get down there, and they just stay in that same state. Well, think about what you do with your residue. If you chop your residue up in little fine pieces and don't mix it with the soil, guess what? You're creating a stack of papers on the soil surface, and instead of mineralizing residue, you're going to have a stack of papers that doesn't get oxygen, and you're going to immobilize that nitrogen to start breaking that residue down during the growing season, when you're really wanting to mineralize nitrogen and make it available to the crop. So mineralization then is that process of releasing that nitrogen into the soil, and how you manage residue will have a great impact on that mineralization process. So the size of the residue, tillage system, what you do with it, the environment, the microbial food that you provide those organisms to break it down, will all drive that mineralization process faster or slower. Again, it's either mineralizing or immobilizing in your soil. So you want to make sure that you are trying to do everything you can to create more mineralization in the growing season, as opposed to immobilization. So remember this field we talked about earlier? This grower went into this growing season with a plan, and Mother Nature changed that plan because he started losing some to denitrification and leaching. But really, what we need to understand is we need to have a plan, but then we need to have a plan B or a plan C. We need to make sure we have a base rate down. How much? It varies with your soil type. It varies with the carbon nitrogen ratio of the residue you've plowed down. But you want to have a good base rate of nitrogen to get that corn plant through that V6, V7 stage. Because once you get to that V7 to V8, that's when that corn plant starts using about 7 to 10 pounds of nitrogen a day. That's when we start forming the number of rows around that ear. And then at that stage, that corn plant really takes off. So you want a base rate to ensure you've got good nitrogen levels in your soil to get that corn plant to that V8 stage. And then when you have that rainfall event that we talked about earlier, let's go out and measure. I get a lot of growers all the time who say, Jim, how much nitrogen I lost after that heavy rainfall? Let's go out, let's measure it, and then let's adjust the program. You may need to apply more nitrogen to grow the same amount of corn. Maybe we're having a growing season, we have great mineralization, we have good aeration, we have good temperatures, and we're mineralizing more in. Let's go measure that, and let's adjust our program. But the nice thing about doing that is you're making decisions in season, closer to the decision time, using measuring technologies, and then applying based on the growing season to maximize your corn yields. So it allows us to really grow more corn and yet minimize the impact in the environment.